The political gravity of the phrase, peace plan, is that it sounds neutral, benevolent, almost inevitable, and yet in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, it is anything but. What recent polling and public reaction inside Ukraine make clear is that proposals associated with Donald Trump are not being received as off-ramps from war, but as signals about whose interests would ultimately be prioritized. When roughly 3/4 of Ukrainians say they reject such a plan, that response is less about partisan politics in the United States and more about lived experience after years of invasion, occupation, and mass violence. Ukrainians are not responding to the label attached to a proposal. They are responding to what history has taught them to hear underneath it. When a plan is described as ending the war quickly, that word does not land as reassurance in Ukraine. It lands as a warning. Speed, in this context, has become shorthand for compromise made under pressure, and more specifically, compromise extracted from the country that was invaded rather than the country that did the invading. Ukrainians have learned, through repeated experience, that when powerful outsiders talk about urgency, it is often their urgency, not Ukraine's security, that is being prioritized. The substance Ukrainians expect from any so-called fast peace is territorial concession. That expectation is not speculative. It is rooted in how previous conflicts with Russia have been handled and frozen rather than resolved. From Georgia to Crimea in 2014, ceasefires and negotiated pauses did not end aggression, they rearranged it. Lines drawn on maps became launch pads for future offensives. In Ukraine, those lessons are not theoretical case studies. They are recent, personal, and reinforced by mass displacement, occupation, and documented war crimes. When Ukrainians hear about giving up land to stop fighting, they hear about giving up people's homes and the legal acknowledgement that those losses were crimes rather than fate's accomplice. There is also a moral dimension to this rejection that is often flattened in international debate. For Ukrainians, territory is not just soil, it is citizenship. Areas proposed for concession are not empty spaces, but communities where Ukrainians have been subjected to filtration camps, forced deportations, and the erasure of language and identity. A peace plan that treats these regions as bargaining chips implicitly accepts that those civilians can be written off for the sake of stability elsewhere. Ukrainians recognize that logic instantly, and they reject it not out of stubbornness, but out of a refusal to normalize the idea that invasion works if you hold on long enough. Another reason the branding fails is that Ukrainians have watched Russia repeatedly violate agreements without consequence. The Budapest Memorandum, which guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, is not an obscure diplomatic artifact in Kyiv. It is a foundational trauma. That document promised security through international assurances, and what followed instead was annexation and war. So when a new peace plan is floated without clear, enforceable mechanisms to constrain Russia, Ukrainians do not see diplomacy. They see another promise designed to expire quietly once it becomes inconvenient to enforce. The emphasis on speed also clashes with the reality Ukrainians experience on the ground. Wars do not end cleanly for the country being invaded. They end with accountability, reconstruction, and the long work of repairing civic trust. A plan that prioritizes immediate silence over justice risks locking in instability. Ukrainians understand that a ceasefire which leaves Russian forces in occupied territory does not stop violence. It displaces it into prisons, basements, and administrative systems where repression continues out of sight of international cameras. Peace that cannot be monitored or defended is not peace, it is camouflage. Importantly, Ukrainians are not rejecting negotiation as a concept. They are rejecting asymmetry in negotiation. Any plan that assumes Ukraine must give more because it is weaker misunderstands how Ukrainians now see themselves. The war has transformed public expectations of the state and its role. Citizens who have endured missile strikes, blackouts, and conscription are acutely aware of the price already paid. To accept a deal that retroactively justifies that suffering as leverage rather than resistance would be to reframe sacrifice as futility. That is not a framing any democratic government in Ukraine could survive. There is also skepticism about who would be asked to enforce this peace. Proposals that rely on goodwill rather than guarantees are especially suspect. Ukrainians have seen how quickly international attention can shift and how unevenly consequences are applied to Russia. Without explicit security commitments, clear penalties for violations, and a framework that restores sovereignty rather than diluting it, peace becomes conditional on Russia's restraint. Ukrainians do not believe restraint is Russia's governing strategy, and nothing in recent history suggests otherwise. Ultimately, Ukrainians are evaluating peace plans the same way they evaluate military aid, by asking whether it improves their long-term security or merely pauses their vulnerability. The answer they are reaching, overwhelmingly, is that plans marketed as quick fixes tend to do the latter. They are not rejecting peace because they are indifferent to suffering. They are rejecting a version of peace that treats suffering as an acceptable cost of geopolitical convenience. The distinction matters, and Ukrainians are making it with clarity born from experience, not ideology. Trust in this war is not an abstract diplomatic currency. It is something Ukrainians measure against specific moments when their survival depended on outside decisions. When Ukrainians evaluate a peace proposal associated with Donald Trump, they are not starting from a blank slate. They are recalling a record that, from their perspective, repeatedly introduced uncertainty at moments when clarity and resolve mattered most. In wartime, uncertainty is not neutral. It is dangerous. Trump's public admiration for Vladimir Putin did not register in Ukraine as unconventional rhetoric or domestic political theater. It registered as a signal. Praise for an authoritarian leader who was actively violating international borders was read not as flattery but as tolerance, if not endorsement. Ukrainians noticed how often Putin was described as smart or strong, and how rarely Russia was described as accountable. In a conflict where narrative legitimacy shapes international response, those words mattered. They suggested a worldview in which power, not law, sets the terms, and that worldview aligns uncomfortably well with Moscow's justification for invasion. The memory that most sharply defines Ukrainian skepticism, however, is not rhetorical. It is procedural. In 2019, U.S. military aid approved by Congress was temporarily withheld while Ukraine was under active threat from Russia. For Ukrainians, that pause was not an internal American controversy. It was a moment when assistance they were counting on became leverage in a domestic political dispute thousands of miles away. The lesson drawn was not simply that aid could be delayed, but that Ukraine's security could be treated as negotiable. That impression lingers, especially when assessing promises that hinge on personal deal-making rather than institutional commitment. Trust is also shaped by Trump's repeated questioning of NATO's value and the reliability of collective defense. For Ukrainians, NATO is not a talking point. It is the clearest existing framework for deterring Russian aggression. When Trump suggested that allies might not be defended if they failed to meet spending targets, Ukrainians heard a conditional approach to security guarantees. In a war where deterrence failure has already produced catastrophic consequences, conditionality sounds like an invitation for Moscow to test limits once again. Ukrainians also pay attention to consistency, or the lack of it. Trump's foreign policy style emphasized unpredictability as a negotiating tactic. While that approach may appeal to some as strength, it is deeply unsettling to a country fighting for its survival. Unpredictability means that today's assurance could become tomorrow's reversal, depending on mood, media cycle, or perceived personal advantage. Ukrainians have learned that survival depends on sustained, predictable support, not on improvisation driven by personality. Another factor shaping distrust is Trump's framing of international relationships as transactional rather than principled. When alliances are described primarily in terms of cost-benefit analysis, smaller states hear a warning. Ukraine understands that it does not offer the kind of economic leverage that typically anchors transactional diplomacy. Its value lies in defending norms, sovereignty, territorial integrity, resistance to aggression that do not easily translate into immediate profit. A peace plan emerging from a worldview that prioritizes deal efficiency over normative stability raises concerns about whose interests would ultimately be protected. There is also the question of enforcement. Peace agreements do not fail because they are signed, they fail because they are violated. Ukrainians are acutely aware that Russia has violated nearly every major agreement it has signed related to Ukraine. When assessing a Trump-associated peace plan, Ukrainians ask a simple question: what happens the first time Russia breaks it? Given Trump's historical reluctance to confront Putin directly and his skepticism toward multilateral enforcement mechanisms, many Ukrainians conclude that violations would be met with ambiguity rather than consequence. Ambiguity, again, favors the aggressor. Ukrainians also observe how Trump frames Ukraine itself. When Ukraine is discussed as a burden, a cost, or a peripheral concern, it reinforces fears that its fate could be traded away to simplify broader geopolitical tensions. In contrast, Ukrainians have responded more positively to leaders who frame Ukraine as a frontline defender of shared democratic values. The difference is not semantic. It signals whether Ukraine is seen as a partner with agency or as a problem to be managed. Crucially, this distrust is not rooted in hostility toward the United States or American voters. Ukrainians continue to express strong appreciation for U.S. military and humanitarian support. The skepticism is targeted, specific, and informed by experience. It reflects an understanding that leadership styles matter in war, and that personal instincts can shape policy outcomes as much as formal positions. When Ukrainians reject a peace plan associated with Trump, they are not rejecting diplomacy. They are rejecting a pattern they believe they recognize. Admiration for the aggressor, conditional commitment to allies, and a willingness to treat Ukraine's security as a variable rather than a constant. In a conflict defined by broken promises and violated assurances, trust is earned through consistency, accountability, and demonstrated willingness to confront aggression. From the Ukrainian perspective, that trust has not been established, and without it, even the most elegantly branded peace proposal carries the weight of unresolved doubt. Ukrainian public opinion has not simply shifted during the war, it has consolidated around a set of principles that now function as red lines. Sovereignty is no longer an abstract constitutional concept or a diplomatic talking point. It has been redefined through lived experience, through the daily reality of missile alerts, occupation, and the visible cost of resistance. When Ukrainians reject peace plans that involve territorial compromise, they are articulating a consensus that has been forged not by ideology, but by exposure to what happens when sovereignty is weakened or deferred. Before the full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukrainian society contained a range of views about Russia, NATO, and the feasibility of coexistence. That plurality narrowed dramatically once the invasion began. Cities that had once leaned toward accommodation became sites of bombardment. Regions that were presumed to be culturally or politically ambiguous experienced occupation, filtration, and forced Russification. The effect was clarifying. It stripped away the notion that identity or language could provide protection from imperial ambition. What remained was a broad understanding that sovereignty, if compromised anywhere, would eventually be compromised everywhere. This hardening of public opinion is often misread as inflexibility, but it is better understood as learning. Ukrainians have learned that partial sovereignty does not function as a stable midpoint between war and peace. It functions as a staging ground for renewed violence. Every instance in which Russia has been allowed to retain control over seized territory has been followed not by normalization but by militarization. The lesson drawn is that conceding territory does not end conflict, it reclassifies it. National identity has also undergone a profound shift. The war has accelerated civic cohesion across linguistic, regional, and ethnic lines. Ukrainian identity is increasingly defined by shared political commitment rather than heritage. This has made the defense of sovereignty inseparable from the defense of democratic self-determination. Giving up territory under coercion is no longer viewed as a pragmatic sacrifice. It is seen as a repudiation of the very idea that Ukrainians have the right to choose their own future. That framing makes compromise far more politically and socially costly than outside observers often assume. Tolerance for sacrifice plays a central role in this consensus. Ukrainians are acutely aware of what continued resistance demands: mobilization, economic strain, disrupted families, and the constant presence of loss. The fact that public support for sovereignty remains high despite these costs is not accidental. It reflects a calculation that the alternative, a settlement that legitimizes occupation, would ultimately demand even greater sacrifice later, under worse conditions and with fewer allies. In this calculus, endurance is not romanticized, but surrender is understood as deferred danger. This perspective has reshaped the political space available to Ukrainian leadership. Any government perceived as trading sovereignty for quiet would face immediate legitimacy challenges. Democratic accountability matters here. Ukraine is not an authoritarian system capable of imposing unpopular settlements by force. Public consent is a prerequisite for durable policy. Leaders know that an agreement rejected by the population would not stabilize the country, it would fracture it. That reality constrains negotiation not because Ukrainians oppose peace, but because they oppose a peace that undermines the social contract forged during wartime. There is also a generational dimension to this hardened view. Younger Ukrainians, many of whom came of age after 2014, have no memory of Russia as a benign or neutral neighbor. Their political consciousness has been shaped entirely by conflict, resistance, and mobilization. For them, sovereignty is not an inherited assumption. It is something actively defended. That makes territorial compromise feel less like diplomacy and more like betrayal of a generation's defining experience. Outside proposals that frame Ukrainian resistance as excessive or unrealistic often fail to account for this internal transformation. What may appear to foreign analysts as stubbornness is, from within Ukraine, coherence. The war has aligned public opinion around a belief that peace without sovereignty is unstable, unjust, and ultimately temporary. That belief is reinforced by daily evidence from occupied territories, where repression continues even in the absence of active fighting. Importantly, Ukrainians distinguish between negotiation and capitulation. They are not rejecting dialogue or diplomacy as tools. They are rejecting outcomes that institutionalize vulnerability. Any agreement that leaves Ukraine with diminished control over its borders is perceived not as an end state, but as an intermission. The expectation is that Russia would use such an interval to regroup, rearm, and return. This expectation is not speculative, it is drawn from pattern recognition. The hardened stance on sovereignty is therefore not a refusal to imagine peace. It is a refusal to imagine peace divorced from security, justice, and agency. Ukrainians have concluded that a war ended on terms dictated by the aggressor would not be remembered as peace at all, but as a pause before repetition. That conclusion now sits at the center of public opinion, shaping how every external proposal is evaluated, regardless of who presents it or how attractively it is framed. The reaction inside Ukraine also functions as a signal flare aimed outward, particularly toward Washington and European capitals, warning against the assumption that peace can be engineered without democratic buy-in from the country doing the fighting. For years, Ukraine has been framed as a recipient of security decisions made elsewhere, but the war has fundamentally altered that dynamic. Ukrainian society now sees itself not as a passive object of diplomacy, but as an active political actor whose consent is indispensable. Any attempt to bypass that reality risks producing an agreement that exists on paper but collapses in practice. From the Ukrainian perspective, peace that is negotiated over their heads is not merely insulting, it is structurally unstable. Democratic legitimacy is not a decorative feature of a settlement, it is the mechanism that makes compliance possible. Soldiers who are expected to stand down, civilians who are expected to return, and institutions that are expected to enforce new boundaries all require a shared belief that the outcome is just. Without that belief, the authority of the agreement erodes immediately. Ukrainians are communicating to their allies that ignoring public consent is not a shortcut to peace, but a guarantee of future instability. This message has particular resonance in the United States, where election cycles can tempt policymakers to prioritize visible outcomes over durable ones. Ukrainians are acutely aware that foreign governments operate under domestic political pressure, and they understand the appeal of presenting a deal as a success. What they are pushing back against is the idea that such a deal can substitute for the slower, harder work of aligning military realities with political legitimacy. A peace agreement timed to an election calendar, rather than grounded in Ukrainian consent, would be vulnerable from the moment it is announced. For Europe, the implications are equally significant. European security has been directly reshaped by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and many European leaders recognize that the outcome of this war will define the continent's strategic environment for decades. Ukrainians are reminding Europe that stability cannot be purchased by asking Ukraine to absorb the cost of insecurity on everyone else's behalf. A settlement that leaves Ukraine weakened would not contain the threat. It would relocate it closer to NATO's borders and normalize the use of force as a tool of revision. There is also a warning embedded in this reaction about the limits of diplomatic abstraction. Peace plans drafted in distant capitals often rely on generalized language about de-escalation, balance, and compromise. Ukrainians are signaling that such language must be grounded in enforcement mechanisms that are credible to those who have experienced occupation. Without clear guarantees, military, economic, and political, peace becomes aspirational rather than operational. Allies are being told, in effect, that intentions are insufficient substitutes for commitments. Another dimension of this message concerns precedent. If Ukraine were pressured into accepting a settlement it overwhelmingly rejects, the signal sent to other countries facing coercion would be stark. It would suggest that international support is conditional not on justice or legality, but on endurance and convenience. Ukrainians understand that their war is being watched globally, not only by allies, but by other authoritarian regimes assessing the costs of aggression. Their resistance to impose peace is therefore also a resistance to setting a precedent in which might eventually makes right. The reaction also complicates the role of mediators. Traditionally, mediation assumes some distance from the conflict, a posture of neutrality. Ukrainians are challenging that model by insisting that neutrality between aggressor and victim is not neutral at all. Any actor seeking to broker peace must grapple with the moral asymmetry of the war. Ignoring that asymmetry in the name of expediency undermines the credibility of the mediator and the sustainability of the outcome. Ukrainians are effectively saying that legitimacy cannot be outsourced. This has implications for alliance cohesion. Allies who underestimate Ukrainian public opinion risk misalignment not only with Kyiv but with their own stated values. Many Western governments have framed their support for Ukraine as a defense of democratic principles. Pressuring a democracy to accept an outcome its population rejects would contradict that framing and weaken public support at home. Ukrainians are reminding their partners that values-based policy requires consistency, even when it is inconvenient. The message extends to post-war reconstruction as well. Reconstruction is not simply about rebuilding infrastructure, It is about rebuilding trust in institutions and international partnerships. If peace is achieved through coercion or disregard for public consent, that trust will be fragile. Ukrainians would enter the post-war period with skepticism toward the very actors expected to help rebuild their country. That skepticism could shape political alignments for years, affecting everything from security cooperation to economic integration. By articulating their rejection so clearly, Ukrainians are attempting to narrow the range of acceptable diplomatic outcomes before negotiations even begin. This is not obstructionism, it is agenda setting. They are defining the parameters within which peace can be legitimate, signaling that agreements which violate those parameters will not be durable. For allies accustomed to steering outcomes through leverage, this represents a recalibration of roles. Ukraine is not asking to be spoken for, it is insisting on being listened to. In that sense, the rejection of externally favored peace plans is less about any single proposal and more about redefining the relationship between Ukraine and its supporters. It is a demand for partnership rather than patronage, for consent rather than compliance. Ukrainians are making clear that the end of the war cannot be negotiated as a technical problem to be solved, but must be approached as a democratic outcome that requires the participation and approval of the people who have borne its costs. The broader implication of Ukrainian resistance to externally driven peace plans is that the war's outcome will be shaped as much by public consent as by military maneuvering. This challenges a common assumption in international politics that wars end when battlefield dynamics shift decisively or when great powers decide the costs have become too high. In Ukraine's case, neither factor alone is sufficient. The endurance of the war is now bound to a population that views the conflict not as a discrete policy problem, but as a defining national struggle whose resolution must align with collective understanding of justice and security. Ukrainians are signaling that legitimacy is a strategic variable. An agreement reached without societal buy-in would not translate into compliance on the ground. Soldiers who have fought for years under the belief that they are defending their country's existence cannot simply be instructed to accept an outcome that contradicts that belief. Civil institutions tasked with enforcing borders, administering occupied areas, or integrating displaced populations would struggle to function under an agreement perceived as imposed or unjust. In this sense, public consent is not an afterthought. It is a precondition for stability. This reality reframes how military success is measured. Gains and losses on the battlefield matter, but they do not automatically produce political resolution. Ukrainians understand that even a favorable ceasefire line is meaningless if it leaves unresolved questions of sovereignty, accountability, and future security. Conversely, continued resistance is sustained not solely by optimism about victory, but by a belief that fighting now reduces the likelihood of repeating the same war later. This belief underpins willingness to endure prolonged hardship, and it complicates external efforts to push for rapid closure. The emphasis on consent also reflects a deeper democratic instinct that has strengthened during the war. Civic participation has expanded, trust in national institutions has been tested, and in many cases reinforced, and political legitimacy has become tightly linked to transparency and responsiveness. In this environment, decisions made behind closed doors or presented as fate's accomplice are met with suspicion. Ukrainians are asserting that democratic process does not pause during wartime. If anything, it becomes more consequential. This insistence on consent intersects with concerns about accountability. Ukrainians do not see peace as separate from justice. War crimes, forced deportations, and systematic targeting of civilians are not peripheral issues to be set aside for the sake of expediency. They are central to how Ukrainians define the war itself. A settlement that ignores accountability would be perceived as an erasure of suffering and an invitation to repetition. Public consent is therefore tied to whether an agreement acknowledges harm and establishes mechanisms to address it. The signal being sent to international actors is that shortcuts are illusory. A deal that looks efficient in diplomatic terms may be fragile in social terms. Ukrainians are highlighting that peace imposed without consent is not merely ethically questionable, it is strategically unsound. Such a peace would require constant external enforcement, continuous financial support to prop up legitimacy, and suppression of dissent, all of which increase long-term costs for allies. In contrast, a peace rooted in public consent, even if slower to achieve, would be self-sustaining. This dynamic also shapes how Ukraine engages with its partners. Ukrainians are not positioning themselves as passive recipients of security guarantees, but as co-authors of the post-war order. They are making clear that their willingness to align with Western institutions, norms, and security frameworks is contingent on being treated as a democratic equal rather than a problem to be managed. This stance influences negotiations not only about ending the war, but about Ukraine's future role in Europe and the broader international system. The emphasis on public consent further complicates the influence of election cycles in allied countries. Ukrainians are aware that political leadership in democracies changes, and they are wary of agreements that depend on the continuity of specific leaders or parties. A peace that relies on sustained support must be anchored in institutions and public opinion on both sides. Ukrainians are effectively saying that their own public opinion will not bend simply to accommodate external political timelines, and that expecting it to do so underestimates the depth of domestic resolve. This approach also affects deterrence. By demonstrating that society remains committed even under prolonged strain, Ukrainians aim to alter Russia's calculations. If Moscow believes that Ukrainian resistance will collapse under pressure for a negotiated settlement, it has little incentive to compromise. Public rejection of unfavorable peace plans signals the opposite. That time alone will not deliver acquiescence. In this way, public consent becomes part of the strategic messaging of the war. The insistence on consent does not imply rigidity. Ukrainians understand that wars end through negotiation. What they are rejecting is the idea that negotiation should begin by narrowing Ukrainian options rather than expanding them. They are asserting that any durable settlement must emerge from a position where Ukrainians feel secure enough to choose peace freely, not coerced by exhaustion or external impatience. That distinction shapes not only how peace might be reached, but whether it would hold. By foregrounding public consent, Ukrainians are redefining what success looks like at the end of this war. Success is not simply the absence of fighting, it is the presence of a political order that Ukrainians recognize as legitimate and worth defending. That definition complicates diplomatic efforts, but it also provides a clearer roadmap. Peace that aligns military realities with democratic legitimacy has a chance to endure. Peace that ignores either element risks becoming another chapter in a cycle Ukrainians are determined to break. Taken together, these dynamics explain why the rejection of externally driven peace plans in Ukraine is not a reflexive dismissal of diplomacy, but a coherent national position shaped by experience, memory, and democratic expectation. Ukrainians are weighing proposals not by how quickly they promise silence, but by whether they resolve the underlying conditions that made the war possible in the first place. Speed without security, compromise without accountability, and peace without consent are understood as temporary arrangements that defer violence rather than end it. What emerges is a clear warning to outside actors. Any attempt to end the war by prioritizing geopolitical convenience over Ukrainian agency is likely to fail. The war has transformed Ukrainian society in ways that make imposed outcomes politically unsustainable and strategically fragile. Public opinion, national identity, and tolerance for sacrifice have converged around a belief that sovereignty and security are indivisible, and that surrendering either undermines both. This convergence limits the space for deals that reward aggression, regardless of how attractively they are framed. The implications extend beyond Ukraine. How this war ends will shape international norms around invasion, deterrence, and the value of democratic consent in conflict resolution. Ukrainians are asserting that legitimacy is not an accessory to peace, but its foundation. Agreements that disregard this reality may achieve momentary calm, but they will carry the seeds of future conflict. A settlement that aligns military realities with public consent, accountability, and enforceable security guarantees may take longer and demand more patience. But it is the only kind of peace Ukrainians believe will last.